Maybe you didn't come to this video by conscious decision. Maybe something inside you simply recognized it, before thought appeared, before intention formed. Because there is a very specific moment in human experience, a quiet moment, when something begins to change within you. This change does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself. It does not come with answers. It arrives as a feeling, almost impossible to explain. Maybe it started slowly. So slowly you didn't notice when it began. Perhaps during an ordinary day, nothing special happened. You were living normally, doing everything you always do, when something shifted, nothing external, nothing visible. Yet for a brief moment, you felt different inside your own life, as if you were present, and at the same time observing, as if something moved slightly backward within you, and since then, the world looks the same. But the experience of being alive feels different. Conversations continue. People keep rushing. Problems still exist. But something in you no longer reacts the same way. And maybe a quiet question began appearing. Why don't I feel like I used to? You still laugh, still work, still talk. But there is distance, a silent gap between you and experience. And that gap is the beginning of something rarely understood. Because nobody teaches this stage. People talk about success, happiness, self-improvement, but almost no one talks about the moment identity begins to shift. Not dramatically, but deeply. You may have noticed urgency fading. Things that once felt essential now feel like noise. You try to worry, but worry doesn't fully hold. You try reacting, yet something observes before reaction happens. And this can feel unsettling, because your entire life you believed you were the mind, the inner voice, the constant narrative. But now something strange happens. You notice thoughts. You observe emotions. You watch reactions arise, and a silent question appears. If I can observe my thoughts, who is the observer? This question is not intellectual. It is experiential. And once it appears, something reorganizes within you. You may feel different from others. Not superior, not disconnected, simply different, as if waking inside a world still dreaming, and this can feel lonely. Not because people disappeared, but because identification softened. You begin seeing patterns, emotional reactions, repeated conversations, and something inside quietly watches, without judgment, without resistance, only awareness. This discomfort is not regression, it is integration. What you feel is not something going wrong, it is consciousness becoming aware. For years, the mind operated automatically, reacting, protecting, creating identity. But now, the observer has begun awakening. And when the observer awakens, the identity created by thought loses its central position. At first, this can feel like emptiness, because what once defined you no longer fully does. And what you are becoming has not yet taken shape. You are between selves, between past and present, between identity and awareness, between character and observer. Maybe you tried returning to old motivations, old ambitions, old concerns, but something inside has already seen beyond them, and that is why you are here. Because part of you knows, this change is not an accident, not an error, not loss, it is transition. In the next minutes we will explore why you feel different after awakening, why relationships begin shifting, why goals lose meaning, and why this phase can feel quietly isolating even when life appears normal. But before we continue, leave this question open within you. What if not belonging to the old world anymore is the sign that awakening has truly begun? Because when consciousness recognizes itself, it does not force, it does not shout, it simply observes. And when observation changes, reality begins responding differently. Maybe you do not fully see it yet, but something inside already knows. You are not lost. You are crossing an invisible threshold of human awareness, and few people speak about this, because few arrive here consciously, and now the real journey begins. After something awakens within you, the world does not immediately change, and this is one of the hardest parts to understand, because you expected external transformation, clarity, answers, but what changes first is perception. You continue living the same life, yet you begin seeing through it. You may notice conversations becoming exhausting. Not because people are wrong, but because something in you can no longer fully immerse in superficiality. You listen while simultaneously observing. You participate, yet something remains silent within. And that silence begins expanding, not as isolation, but as presence. You may start recognizing human patterns with unusual clarity, automatic reactions, repeated conflicts, shared fears, collective desires. Collective desires, as if you suddenly perceive the invisible mechanics of the human mind. And this can feel strange, because you still care deeply about people, yet you no longer fully believe the stories everyone tells themselves. Relationships may begin shifting, not through conflict, but through resonance. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly now feel forced. Silences appear. Distance emerges. Many interpret this as loss, but perhaps it is alignment. When consciousness shifts, identification shifts with it. You do not reject the world, you simply stop confusing yourself with it, and this is delicate, because the mind tries explaining this phase using old language. It says, you are lost, you lack motivation, something is wrong. But what if nothing is wrong? What if you are not losing meaning but discovering that previous meaning was never truly yours? For years you learned who to be, what to desire, what success meant, what belonging meant. Awakening does not add something new, it removes layers, and when those layers fall, an unfamiliar space appears. A space where identity has not yet reformed. The ego experiences this as threat, because ego survives through definition, labels, stories, comparisons, but awareness requires none of these. It simply exists. This is why you may experience deep calm, followed by confusion, moments of clarity, followed by uncertainty. This is not regression, it is reorganization. Your inner system is recalibrating perception itself. When you begin observing the mind loses exclusive authority over reality. Thoughts continue, emotions arise, but they no longer define you completely, and this silent shift is revolutionary because for the first time, there is space between stimulus and reaction, between emotion and identity, between experience and interpretation. Within that space, freedom emerges, not external freedom, internal freedom. Freedom from automatic reaction, freedom from believing every thought, freedom to simply observe. You may notice this in small moments. Someone says something that once would hurt you, and you watch the emotion pass. An anxious thought appears, but does not dominate. A memory arises, yet no longer defines identity. These moments seem simple, yet they represent profound transformation, because the center of experience is changing. You were the story. Now you are the space where the story unfolds, and this changes everything. Goals feel different. Urgency softens, time expands. Simple moments become vivid, and while life seems slower inside, a silent intelligence begins emerging, a knowing without thinking, a clearer intuition, an inner guidance beyond effort. Here lies the great confusion. No one teaches how to live after awakening. Awakening is romanticized, integration is rarely explained. You are learning how to live awake, and this learning requires something rare, trust in the unknown, not control, presence. The more you try returning to old patterns, the more artificial they feel. The more you allow silence, the more natural life becomes. Perhaps you have not lost direction. Perhaps you stopped following imposed directions, and began listening inwardly. Something always present, now finally heard. And as we continue, we will explore why this phase can feel lonely, why the mind resists, and how to live without trying to become who you used to be. Because awakening is not becoming someone new, it is recognizing who was always here. There is a stage of awakening that almost nobody explains. Because it does not look spiritual, it does not look enlightened, it does not feel extraordinary. It feels strange, quiet, almost invisible. It is the moment when you realize something inside you has changed, while the world around you continues exactly the same. People keep living as they always have, talking about the same concerns, chasing the same goals, reacting to the same events, repeating familiar stories, and you watch, present, yet somehow different, not emotionally distant, but perceptually shifted. As if you woke up inside the same dream, without being able to fall asleep again. Perhaps you noticed this recently. A conversation happening, and suddenly you see how automatic everything feels. Prepared responses, repeated opinions, instant judgments, and a quiet question arises. Have I always lived like this? This is one of the first true signs of integration. Awakening is not only an experience, it is learning to see the invisible mechanisms of the human mind. And once you see, you cannot unsee. Thoughts appear on their own. Emotions arise without invitation. Reactions begin before conscious choice. Slowly, a new inner position forms. You stop being only the character, and begin becoming the observer of experience. At first, this can feel confusing. Because you were taught your entire life that you are your mind. Your thoughts define you. Your emotions are your identity. Your story is your truth. But now, nothing feels entirely solid. Thoughts come and go. Emotions rise and dissolve. Inner states continuously change, and a deeper question emerges. If everything changes, what remains? This question does not need an answer, it needs space. A silent space where identity loosens. You may notice something unexpected. Things once extremely important lose emotional weight. Arguments feel unnecessary. The need to prove yourself fades. Not because you gave up on life, but because something deeper becomes meaningful. Presence. Moments where simply being alive feels complete. Breathing, walking, feeling sunlight, watching light move through a room, and in those moments, nothing is missing. The mind may interpret this as loss of ambition, but perhaps it is the first experience of living without psychological pressure. For years, maybe decades, your energy sustained an identity, trying to be accepted, recognized, validated, and now, something relaxes, not because everything was achieved, but because you realize nothing essential was ever missing. This relaxation changes your relationship with time. The future loses urgency, the past loses emotional gravity. The present expands. Simple moments become vivid, silence feels alive, and something unexpected happens. You begin feeling different from others. Not superior, not inferior, simply different. Conversations feel shallow, environments feel draining, old interests lose attraction. This can feel frightening, because ego interprets change as loss of belonging, but perhaps it is alignment. You are not leaving the world, you are leaving unconscious participation in it. This phase can feel deeply lonely, because it is difficult to explain. How do you describe being the same person, yet completely changed? Many believe they are lost here, but they are actually meeting themselves for the first time. Awareness withdraws energy from automatic patterns. Reactivity softens, impulse weakens, control relaxes, and a new way of living emerges. Quieter, more present, more real. You learn you do not need to react instantly. You can observe, feel without becoming trapped. Allow experiences to move through you. Perhaps this is the real transformation. You stop trying to control life, and begin participating in it. And strangely, the less resistance you hold, the more life flows. Decisions feel intuitive, encounters feel meaningful. Life seems to respond differently to awareness itself. Perhaps awakening was never about escaping reality. Perhaps it was about finally being fully here, without masks, without constant effort, without rigid identity. And a new question arises. If I am not my thoughts, what is living through me? This question opens the next phase. Because awakening does not end when you wake up. It begins when you learn to live awake. And here something unexpected begins to appear, a silent peace, independent of circumstances. But before understanding that peace, we must explore why awakening often brings deep loneliness, and why that loneliness is not absence, but expansion. There is a phase of awakening almost nobody anticipates. Because awakening does not only bring clarity, it brings silence, a strange inner silence that grows. Even while the world remains loud, you continue living your normal life, talking to the same people, moving through familiar environments, yet something fundamental has shifted in how experience unfolds. It feels as if part of you stepped back and began watching life happen, not only observing others, observing yourself. You notice reactions forming, impatience before words, fear before decisions, anxiety before thoughts complete themselves, and for the first time, space appears between stimulus and reaction. That space is small, almost invisible, yet inside it lives freedom. You may notice something unexpected. Situations that once overwhelmed you now move through you more gently. Anger appears, sadness appears, joy appears, and all of them pass, and when they pass, something remains, a silent presence. Before awakening, you lived inside the mind, now you begin living beside it, and this changes everything. The mind evolved for survival. It predicts, it worries, it replays memories, it imagines threats, it tries to protect continuously. But now you begin to see, many protections were repetitions. Old programs responding to a past that no longer exists. Thoughts still arise, but belief weakens. The mind says something is wrong, awareness observes, and nothing is actually happening. Fear appears, the body remains calm, and a quiet realization emerges. Thinking is not knowing. For years, the mental voice guided reality. Now something radical happens. The mind speaks endlessly. Consciousness listens silently, and silence begins to feel more truthful than thought. This marks a turning point. Previously, thinking shaped perception. Now perception shapes thinking. You observe before reacting, and the more you observe, the less drama survives. Without identification, conflict dissolves. Without resistance, experience flows. Something unexpected follows. Life slows internally. Even while the world moves fast, external chaos may exist, yet inner calm remains. Problems arise, yet space exists around them. Uncertainty appears, yet stability remains untouched. This stability does not come from answers, it comes from presence. Peace does not appear when life becomes perfect. Peace appears when resistance ends. Your relationship with control begins to change. Planning once felt necessary. Predicting felt safe. Controlling felt intelligent. Now control feels heavy, exhausting, artificial. Something deeper replaces it. Trust, not trust in outcomes, trust in awareness itself. You begin sensing that decisions emerge naturally when not forced. Insights arise within silence. Paths reveal themselves without struggle. Many awakened individuals notice synchronicities here, meaningful encounters, ideas appearing precisely when needed, life responding differently, not because reality is controlled, but because resistance has softened. Awareness does not force, it allows, and allowance reorganizes experience. Yet another realization appears. The more stable your awareness becomes, the more visible unconscious behavior becomes in others. And this can create a subtle loneliness, not isolation, perceptual solitude. You begin seeing patterns everywhere, automatic reactions, ego-driven conflicts, collective fear loops. You recognize that many people are not fully present. They are living inside continuous mental narration, just as you once did. This realization often brings compassion. No one is wrong. Everyone awakens in their own timing. You stop trying to convince others. Stop explaining endlessly. Stop attempting to wake those not ready, because awakening cannot be forced. It unfolds when awareness recognizes itself. Acceptance brings lightness. Relationships simplify. Interactions soften. You no longer perform identity, you simply exist. Breathing, observing, participating. And quietly, something begins to bloom. A peace independent of circumstances. A feeling of being at home within yourself. But this peace holds another secret. The next phase is not only feeling presence, it is learning how to live in the world without losing it. And that is where our journey continues. There is a quiet moment in awakening when you realize you are no longer trying to return to who you once were. For a while, you believed this shift was temporary, that eventually things would go back to normal, that the strange feeling would fade. But something becomes undeniable. There is no going back, because what changed was not your external life. It was the place from which life is experienced. Before you lived trying to improve yourself. Now you begin to sense that perhaps there was never a fixed self to improve. This realization can feel disorienting. For years, identity was built from stories. Stories about who you were, who you should become, who you needed to be in order to feel complete. And slowly those stories lose their authority. They do not vanish instantly, but they stop feeling absolute. Thoughts still arise. I must prove myself. I must reach somewhere. I must become better. And for the first time, you observe without immediately obeying. A deeper question emerges. Better for whom? Reach where? Prove what? Prove what? These questions are not intellectual. They arise from silence, from a space prior to thought. You begin realizing that much human suffering came from constantly trying to become someone else. Always chasing a future where peace would finally arrive. Now something unexpected happens. Moments of completeness appear without reason. Simple moments, breathing, looking at the sky, feeling the body soften, existing without needing resolution. And within those moments comes a powerful discovery. Peace is not achieved. It appears when escape from the present ends. Your relationship with time transforms. The future loses urgency. The present gains depth. Success itself changes meaning. No longer only external achievement, but quality of presence. Ordinary activities become vivid. Drinking water, walking, listening, working, life feels alive again. Not because reality changed, but because attention returned. You begin noticing how the mind constantly tried to escape direct experience, running toward problems, goals, narratives. Now, when presence remains, mental urgency fades. The body begins to relax. Breathing deepens. Reactivity softens. The nervous system learns safety. Awakening is not only mental, it is biological. The body learns it no longer needs constant defense. And when the body relaxes, perception expands. You notice subtleties, silence between words, emotional tone in interactions, atmosphere in environments, inner signals before decisions. Intuition appears not as mysticism, but as silent clarity, knowing without overthinking. And as trust in silence grows, life stops feeling like struggle. It becomes movement, flow. Yet this phase brings sensitivity. Not everyone around you experiences reality this way. Conversations may feel superficial, conflicts unnecessary, collective fears distant. You may wonder, am I becoming disconnected? You are not disconnecting. You are no longer living entirely inside collective mental noise. Relationships change form, more presence, less approval seeking, more listening, less defending, more authenticity, less performance. You realize you no longer need to prove who you are. And that freedom brings lightness, a lightness independent of circumstance, born from the absence of internal conflict. Perhaps the deepest sign of awakening is this: you begin trusting life, not because you understand everything, but because control is no longer required for peace. And from that trust, something profoundly human returns: curiosity, spontaneity, creativity. Life moves through you again. Instead of being pushed by effort, you discover awakening was never about escaping the world. It was about finally being fully present within it, without masks, without internal warfare, without becoming someone else. And in that realization, something settles, as if you have finally arrived home, yet the journey continues. Because the next stage is not only feeling presence, but learning how to live steadily within it, and that is where we go next. There is a very specific moment in awakening, one that few people describe clearly, because it is not dramatic enough to be called transformation, and not comfortable enough to be ignored. It is the moment when you realize you cannot return to living the way you once did, not because the external world changed, but because perception changed. And when perception changes, reality You may have noticed this. Situations that once triggered you intensely, now feel distant. Conversations that once mattered deeply, now feel repetitive. Concerns that once consumed your energy, now seem like echoes of an old pattern. And quietly, a question arises: if I am no longer that version, who am I now? This is not intellectual curiosity, it is internal transition. You are crossing an invisible bridge. Externally, life may look similar. Internally, everything feels altered. You begin noticing how much of your former identity was sustained by effort. Effort to be accepted, effort to be recognized, effort to be valued, effort to maintain coherence. And now, that effort feels heavy, not because you stopped caring, but because something deeper is emerging. You begin sensing that silence within is more real than narrative, that awareness is more stable than emotion, that observation is more constant than reaction. And this shifts your internal gravity. Less dragged by impulses, less captured by judgment, less defined by automatic reaction. There is a slowing happening, not lack of ambition, clarity. You see how much of your life was shaped by invisible conditioning, social expectations, unconscious comparison, inherited fear, validation-driven desire. And as awareness illuminates these movements, you realize something profound. You were never those patterns, you only believed them. As that belief weakens, identity built upon it weakens. This can feel unstable, because the mind craves certainty. It wants to know exactly who you are. But awareness does not require rigid definition. Awareness is space, and space does not need form. You may notice less urgency to define yourself, less need to label experience. You allow things to be as they are, without immediately interpreting. Suffering begins losing its foundation, because much suffering came from resistance. Resistance to what is, resistance to emotion, resistance to others. Now, emotion may still arise, but resistance softens. You feel without collapsing, observe without detaching coldly. Integration begins. Relationships reorganize, not through force, but through alignment. You no longer participate in unconscious dynamics, no longer reinforce drama, no longer fuel reactive cycles. This may create silence where noise existed, distance where intensity once thrived. But it is not disconnection, it is coherence. You no longer need to convince others, no need to win arguments, because something inside is stable. And from that stability, a new kind of power emerges, not control, presence. Presence that does not impose, presence that does not compete, presence that simply is. And that changes daily life. You notice breath during tension, notice impulse before reaction, notice thought before belief. That gap is freedom. Awakening is not an event. It is stabilization, repeated return to presence, and that return builds internal grounding, an anchor, a center independent of circumstance. You may still feel intense emotion, but you do not collapse into narrative. You may face uncertainty, but panic no longer defines you. That is maturity, conscious maturity. And something deeper unfolds. You begin seeing how perception shapes experience, not magically, directly. Fear sees threat, presence sees possibility, judgment sees error, awareness sees learning. You are no longer just reacting to reality. You are participating in how it reveals itself, and that is responsibility and freedom, because you are no longer trapped in unconscious repetition. Each conscious response strengthens this new way of being, perhaps not a new identity, but essence, and as essence stabilizes, the old self feels distant, not wrong, necessary, a stage. And now, you are entering deeper territory, not just noticing change, but living from it. And what unfolds next goes even further. If you are still here, pause for a moment. Take a slow breath. Notice something simple. You did not just watch a video. You moved through an experience. And perhaps the most important shift did not happen on the screen. It happened inside you. Something reorganized. Maybe subtly, maybe almost invisibly. But something shifted. Because the moment you begin recognizing that you feel different, and realize that this difference is not a mistake, something profound stabilizes within you. For a long time, feeling different may have felt like being lost, like something was wrong, like you no longer fit into your own life. But now, you may be starting to understand something deeper. You were not lost, you were outgrowing old structures, and outgrowing structures is not comfortable, because old structures provided identity, they provided security, they provided predictability, and when those structures begin to dissolve, the mind tries to interpret, tries to label, tries to regain control. But there is something the mind cannot fully capture. Direct experience. You are beginning to notice a space inside you that does not change. A space that has been present in every phase of your life. When you were a child, when you were confused, when you were struggling, when you were confident, that space was always there. What changed were the stories surrounding it. And now you are identifying less with the story, and more with the space. And that changes everything. It changes how you wake up in the morning. It changes how you respond to difficulty. It changes how you perceive conflict. It changes how you imagine the future. Because perhaps you are noticing that the future no longer feels urgent, not because you lost ambition, but because anxiety has softened. You are beginning to sense that you do not need to control every detail for things to be okay. And that internal trust is new. It is not based on guarantees. It is based on perception. You have seen that when you remain present, even difficult situations can be navigated. That when you observe before reacting, suffering decreases. That when you do not immediately identify with every thought, the mind loses its dominance. This is conscious maturity. But something even more subtle is happening. When you change internally, your relational world begins to reorganize, not because you are forcing change, but because you are no longer feeding the same patterns. You may have noticed that certain conversations feel different, certain collective complaints no longer resonate, certain arguments feel exhausting rather than engaging, not because you became superior, but because you are less identified. And when identification decreases, conflict loses fuel. Yet this can create a strange sensation, a feeling of distance, a feeling of not fully belonging in the same way. But here is something important. You are not losing belonging. You are beginning to belong to yourself. And when you truly begin belonging to yourself, old relational dynamics naturally adjust, not as punishment, but as alignment. Relationships are shared energetic fields. When your internal state shifts, the shared field shifts. And this is exactly what we will explore next. Because feeling different is only the beginning. The next layer is understanding how this internal shift transforms your relationships. Why some people seem to drift away. Why others appear unexpectedly. Why certain bonds deepen while others dissolve. And most importantly, how to move through this phase without fear. Because perhaps you are not losing, perhaps you are refining. But before you continue, recognize something deeply personal. You stayed. You did not escape when it became introspective. You did not distract yourself. You remained present, and remaining present is an act of awareness. You may still have doubts, you may still have intense emotional days, you may still experience confusion at times, but something inside you is no longer the same, and that is irreversible. You have seen, you have felt, you have recognized, and recognition cannot be undone. You may fluctuate, you may temporarily forget, but you will not fully return to unconscious living, and that means you are moving, quietly, internally, integrating. Integration does not happen overnight. It happens through repetition, through daily choices to observe before reacting, to breathe before judging, to remain aware even when the mind grows loud. And repetition builds stability, and stability builds freedom. If something in this experience resonated with you, write one word in the comments, just one, not casually, but intentionally. The word that represents the state you are cultivating now: presence, trust, integration, awareness, silence, transition, whatever arose naturally while listening. Because when you write it, you anchor it, and anchored awareness becomes stable awareness. If this journey speaks to you, subscribe not just to follow content, but to follow your own evolution. This series is not about understanding awakening intellectually, it is about living awakening consciously. And in the next video, we enter one of the most sensitive and transformative aspects of this process, why relationships change after awakening. And when you understand this, many things that feel confusing right now will begin to make sense. Grateful you are here. Much light on your path, and remember, you are not becoming someone new. You are returning to who you have always been. I will see you in the next one.